Hi there. I hope you've gotten a lot out of our first few days in class. This next lecture, which is Unit 1B, will focus on contemporary psychology. We're going to touch again on the approaches in psych, and we're also going to talk about the subfields. And we are going to attempt to answer psychology's biggest question. So let's get started. So psych's biggest question is one you've probably heard about time and time again. It's this idea of nature versus nurture, biology versus experience. So nature refers to all things that we are born with, how we look, our genetics, our temperaments, things like that. Nurture refers to our experiences, our environment, how our parents raised us, the influence that our peers have on us, those kinds of things. And for decades, in some cases for centuries, psychologists and people who are interested in human behavior have asked, is it nature or nurture that determines why we act the way we do? Well, modern day psychologists really feel that it's a combination of both. That you are born with a temperament, for example. You're easygoing, you're quote unquote anal retentive, those kinds of things. And that, say, for example, how our parents or our teachers interact with us helps us to manage that temperament. So nature and nurture kind of work together is really the current understanding. So some people that kind of contribute to the nature and nurture issue, the Greeks, as we've looked at, Descartes, and an oldie but a goodie, Charles Darwin and his natural selection. You're probably saying to yourself, Darwin, I thought he was a biology figure. Well, as it turns out, Darwin's idea of natural selection also works when we discuss nature in psychology. So let's just review a little bit of natural selection here. So this is the idea that among the range of inherited trait variations, those that contribute to reproduction and survival will most likely be passed on to succeeding generations. So I always really liked that example, and I was the giraffe example, and I was just talking about this with my kids when we were on a safari in Disney World this summer. That there used to be not just long-necked giraffes, but short-necked giraffes. But the short-necked giraffes could not survive because they couldn't get any food, but the long-necked giraffes could. So consequently, those are the ones that survived, passed their genes on to subsequent generations, and they continue to this day. So natural selection, as we know, is a theory, is an idea that this is kind of how we have evolved into the humans that we are now. But in psychology, we don't just look at who survives and who thrives, but we look at what we do for the people who don't have the survival genes or the ability to evolve. What do we do in our society that helps those people? So we look at both sides of the issue. The nature issue is how we're born, those strong genes that are passed down generation to generation, and then what we do to nurture those who may not have that. I love Charles Darwin. Really interesting discussions with him. In psych, there are three main levels of analysis. And you might say, Mrs. Coates, what am I analyzing? You're analyzing behavior. So there are three ideas that we look at when we analyze behavior: biological, psychological, and social cultural. That comes together and that forms this idea of what we know as the biopsychosocial approach to studying behavior. So here's the definition, which is pretty obvious. It's the idea that incorporates biology, psychology, society, and culture into why we behave the way we do. So here is a chart, a diagram more likely, more accurate, of some influences. So for example, in the biological idea, the influences are things like natural selection, your genetic predispositions, your hormones, your neurotransmitters in your brain, how your brain interacts with your body, those kinds of things. The psychological influence are things like learned fears and other learned expectations that perhaps you experienced or you were taught as you grew up. Emotional responses, how we interpret situations. Those are all psychological influences of why we behave the way we do. Lastly, we have social and cultural influences. So that mainly concerns the presence of others on a small scale and on a large scale. So on a large scale, we have society and we have our culture that influences expectations. On a smaller scale, we have our family. You know, do your parents encourage manners? Do they want you to do your homework every night? Things like that. Those are family expectations. Then, of course, our peers and other groups influences us tremendously. And this continues well past the age of adolescence, that we have many influences in our lives. As we grow and we have our own families, they influence us. As we get into the workforce, those people influence us. And then lastly, there's compelling models of societal influences. These are things like the media, the internet, your social networks. TV is still a popular influence. Music, things like that. So the three main levels of behavioral analysis: biopsychosocial, cultural, influences. So that's a really broad look so far at contemporary psychology. The next piece we're going to look at is different approaches and perspectives. And we've touched on this in class, and we've touched on this in the last lecture. So I'm not going to go through this again, but I really want you to go through, understand, study, read, look for examples of all these different perspectives and approaches to practicing psychology. And there is a lovely chart in your textbook, which is I'm running through really quickly right now, but it'll give you some great understandings. So there are things, there's something in psychology called subfields. And subfields are basically how psychology is used out there. Now, someone might say to you, you can't do anything with a psych degree. And I'm here to tell you that that is not at all true. In fact, it's actually the opposite. You can do a ton of things with a psych degree. Just look at these subfields here: developmental psych, educational psych, personality psych, social psych. These fall under what we call basic research. So I'm just going to take one and tell you all the different ideas that you can do with this. So developmental psychology is probably my favorite of the subfields that we study. This is looking at the human condition, looking at life from the time that we are a small cell inside our mother's womb all the way up through old age and death. So we look at the physical being, cognitive, how you think, how you judge, how you make decisions, and social change throughout our lifespan. And I love this because you can do so many different things with developmental psych degree. You can become a teacher, you can become a counselor, you can do research with old folks, teenagers, little kids. You can look at the educational institutions. You can do a real lot with the developmental psych degree. And that's just one example. Under applied research are some really new, up-and-coming, really great subfields. This first one, industrial organizational psychology. This is working with companies to see how they can most be efficient. So things like assembly lines, or the flow of traffic in a factory, or the flow of traffic in a workplace, how people interact with one another. This is all industrial organizational psych. And this is becoming a more and more popular major. In fact, I was just out to dinner, I would say probably 6 or 8 months ago, and the waitress happened to be a former student of mine, and she was saying how she had gone back to get her master's degree in industrial organizational psych. And she was looking, at that time, she was doing an internship with a company to see how that would work. It's real fascinating stuff. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. I want you to go through and answer the 5-question quiz that is posted on your Aspen account. It's just a Google form. Make sure you submit it. Make sure your email is open and ready to go with that. I think everybody should be, based on what I understand, but just double check on that. And I will see you in class next time. Bye.